the studio is Mary Coogan. She is with Advocates for Children of New Jersey, and welcome. Good to have you here today.
Nice to be here.
Our topic is child abuse and neglect. Can you first set us up by defining, by today's standard, what is child abuse and neglect?
I can try. Child abuse is an action by a parent which is conduct that we consider contrary to the norm, that puts a child at harm's way or actually does harm a child, but it's something that's severe.
Okay, well, when you say severe, my generation, everybody spanked. They paddled in the classroom. What is severe? Well, is that a relative term of art, a subjective term?
Well, we call it a reasonable person standard. So parents can still physically discipline their children. By law, teachers cannot. We call that corporal punishment, and we've tended to make laws that say you cannot physically discipline a child in a classroom. But a parent can still spank their child. I think most state laws will say when it's repetitive, when it's a very young child, or when you're leaving welts or marks, that begins to cross the line.
All right, and what about neglect? What defines neglect?
Well, neglect, again, by most states have their own statutes, and you're really saying a parent who doesn't provide the minimum care necessary for a child. So a child who is malnourished, a child who is living on the street, a child who is never brought to school, is never educated. By law, that can constitute neglect. But again, it's fact sensitive, and that's why we have social workers who work for child protective service agencies that go out and investigate.
Now, a lot of people say, you know what's happening isn't my business. But what if you suspect something's going on, something doesn't look right? Should you report it, or should you confront the parents?
Well, I would say you report it. And now, if you know the parents and you want to talk to them about it, there are people who would argue that maybe a parent is struggling and maybe they're just under a lot of stress, and so you shouldn't just assume they're abusing or neglecting their child. But again, if you see a child who looks not well, looks like they're not being fed properly, they're not clean. And I'm not saying, kids like to put the same clothes on for an entire week. That's not a parent's fault. But when you see a child who really seems to be malnourished, that's when I think you should have more concern. And I think most laws allow people to report anonymously. So you can pick up the call and make the report and let the Child Protective Service Agency sort it out.
Now, Child Protective Services, they've come under a lot of criticism for either overreacting or underreacting, and sometimes as parents we might even be afraid. For instance, my son got hurt. I was a little nervous taking him to the hospital because my older son was a biter and there were bite marks all over him, and I said, I wonder if we're going to be questioned, if we're abusing our child, because there are bite marks all over him.
And I think all the publicity about certain cases, it's natural reaction for a parent to have that concern, and I think many people do share that concern. I think if parents are going to their family doctor and the doctor gets to know the children, and I think the explanation is reasonable, makes sense, most doctors are not going to overly question a child or be overly concerned. I think that we need to have a healthy concern for children's behavior, and many people are trained in terms of the signs of abuse or neglect that would warrant the phone call. But I agree, many people are hesitant and they do get nervous, and there's a lot of programs now where kids are trained about proper touching, etc. And I have had friends where the children were young, they had all this training, and they came home, and I think DIFAS, our Child Protective Service Agency in New Jersey, was called on a third of the parents.
Okay, well, you talk about touching. There are different types of abuse: emotional, sexual, physical. Has the Sandusky case impacted how child services deal?
Well, my colleagues in Pennsylvania say their calls are up.
Really?
Yes, because I think people start to say, oh, we're missing something, and here was a situation where it should have been obvious to people and it wasn't, and so they feel like they should make the report. Again, we would say you make the report. I do think that when you look at the broader scheme, there are, let's say, 800,000 cases of child abuse and neglect in the United States annually, but almost all of them are about neglect. The actual,
really?
Yes, the cases where it's actual sexual abuse, because remember, child abuse is really by a parent or a caretaker. That's not to say children are not sexually assaulted, and it could be by a person who's not a relative, a stranger. That's a criminal activity, but it is not necessarily under what we refer to as child abuse and neglect. We're talking about parents or people in a caretaking responsibility who actually do something affirmatively or don't act when they should and place the child at harm.
I want to get some final thoughts here, whether it be for parents who are in a stressful situation and may need help themselves, or if you are looking at from the outside in on a situation. What final thoughts can you leave us with if you see, or if you're in a situation where there's abuse happening?
Well, I think parents who are under stress, there are agencies and community supports that you can access, and you should find them in your community.
Go online to find these
You
things?
can go online, but a lot of times there is a hotline for reporting abuse and neglect, which will also divert the parents who need help. There's organizations like Parents Anonymous, and they are there and have 800 numbers. You can Google them, and they are there to help parents. I do think if people are concerned about the welfare of a child, it's better to make the call than not make the call.
All right, we put that phone number up there. And Mary, we thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this very sensitive and sad subject.
Thank you for your interest.